Da, da, da. Seeing how it's streaming, checking all the different tabs. This is the joy of having so many different places to stream, all the different locations. All right, are we live? Let's see. Yes, we are live. Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Marcus, Dev Relations at Edge and Node. And I just want to say hi to everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Graph Builders Office Hours. And I think we're having trouble on Discord. We're not streaming on Discord just yet, so I'm going to give a little hesitation, and we won't go into the show just yet. But for right now, I just want to say hi to everyone in the audience. Thank you so much for joining. And we're having a few technical issues in Discord. I'm streaming to Discord. We'll get going in just a second. But in the meantime, I just want to go ahead and introduce Derek from Data Nexus. And if any of you out there who don't know Derek, I'm just going to do as short of an introduction as possible. Legendary indexer, crazy skills, super chill. Is that fair, Derek, I think?
Yeah, I would say that that's flattering. But yeah, just a quick little recap or my own little intro. So Data Nexus, we run an indexer on the graph. We're one of the largest indexers, both in terms of total stake as well as overall query production. So that goes into quality of service of the API requests that we're getting in. I started in the graph more with starting with curation and getting into subgraph development, and I'm a database administrator by trade. And so I got really interested in indexing blockchain data, what that looks like. I actually learned TypeScript for the purpose of building subgraphs. So that's not a language that I was used to beforehand, but I come from like a SQL background, right?
Yeah.
But it's simple enough to pick up. And so I started building subgraphs, and then after that, we ended up launching our indexer. But it gives me this really, really fun perspective of being able to be inside Visual Studio Code, writing something, but also having an understanding of what is this going to look like inside of our database, and which sometimes will change my opinion on which path I want to go and how ultimately what type of a data structure we want to use, that type of stuff.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I wanted to bring you on, Derek. Your experience with databases
Yep.
and also within the graph as an indexer. It's funny. I mean, I've been in this ecosystem for so many years now, and seeing indexers be at the core of this protocol, being really the cogs in the machine that really are turning the gears in this
Mhm.
decentralized data read layer. It's it's a perspective that I think that is unique in that um, so much I'm focusing on in my line of work with builders and hopping in and saying, hey, how can we build better? How can we build cooler applications, decentralized applications? How could we do this in a way that provides new use cases for crypto as a whole? Meanwhile, your job, Derek, is at the core of the graph being like, here they come, here come a dozen subgraphs today, or 10 10, 20, 100 subgraphs, 200 subgraphs. What does it mean for you as an indexer to be at this core of this infrastructure, looking at people all around you just building hackathon projects all the way to full production enterprise ready subgraphs and substreams? I mean, you're really at the core. What is that perspective like?
Yeah, it's kind of wild. I'll share a couple of things that are I would say abnormal but exciting to me. One thing that I think is super odd is like typically in a prior environment or prior to Web3 as a database administrator, we have the keys to the castle and we can just straight up shut a user off type of thing. Or typically we'll have our developer team and someone runs a long running query, and then you can just turn off that user and send them an email and say, hey, please don't run this bad query or whatever. But in our environment, it's totally different. As an indexer, people are deploying in these arbitrary subgraphs that require us to index whatever data that they put in there, and we don't necessarily have a connection to the end developer. And so our job as an indexer is just to take what they make and optimize it as much as we can,
Hmm.
because we likely we won't have contact with that person. And then the next kind of interesting point is you have a subgraph developer, and a lot of the times they're also going to be the consumer and the ones writing queries to that subgraph, but that's not always the case. And we've seen instances where you have lots of different applications that all want information from a single subgraph, and each of them write their queries slightly differently. And there's these little tweaks where I was like, oh, if I could just like send them a quick message like, hey, don't filter it by this and order it by that. Filter and order it by the same thing. It'll make your query like 10 times faster. But ultimately, we can't talk to that person. So it's a very different paradigm. But also, we had something happen probably 4 months ago that was really cool to see. From our side, where we had a total data center service outage. Right, everyone in our data center was shut down for between 2 and 3 hours. And what was really cool is that none of our consumers knew a thing
Mm,
because we were one of the 10 indexers on a subgraph. No one lost service.
mm,
Maybe if we were the most performant indexer, maybe they go down to indexer number 2 that has slightly higher latency or something like that. But it was just totally unnoticeable. So
mm.
we went offline for 3 hours, which normally, like outside of the blockchain world, if you're down for 3 hours, it's just like you need to change your underpants. It gets real crazy. But no one knew, and it was wild. And so obviously from our side, we had fires going off and alarms and all that stuff, and got our services back on. But it really speaks to the resiliency of having a super redundant network, of
Mhm,
having lots of indexers across the planet, different
mm.
geographic locations. I'm in an Airbnb right now because there's a hurricane happening in Tampa.
Right. I was gonna
And
kind of edge into that little bit, and so Derek, if you could let the audience know, you are
yeah,
now you just got away from Hurricane Milton.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And our data center is located in Tampa, so we have our own hurricane preparedness procedures that we start to go through, and making sure that we've got backups in other locations and all that type of stuff. But ultimately, it's funny to say this, but a lot of our attention was on some of the other validator services that we run, because we
Mm,
knew that the graph was just mega redundant. If our servers go down and the subgraphs that we're supporting, we can no longer answer to those queries, other indexers are stepping in and resolving queries, which is very cool.
mm,
So it was kind of an interesting thing to go through that exercise, especially with a hurricane coming in.
mm.
But yeah, I'm currently in Nashville, Tennessee. We drove up here just to keep things nice and easy, and we'll let power turn back on and then head back down.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just happy you and everyone's seems. Are you with your family or with friends?
Oh
Is it
yeah, they're outside
everyone's
right
there?
now though. I'm not letting them in the house.
Okay. Well, I'm glad everyone's all right.
Yep.
Nashville's a lot of fun, so we can make it a little vacation.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, we had a surprise vacation essentially. The food
yeah,
here has been great.
yeah. And I like that. I mean, the infrastructure provided by the graph. I was asking, what is your perspective? And the thing that you went to was a real life situation that you're in right now that
Yeah,
involves a hurricane. And the graph and the inherent qualities of the graph have provided you a peace of mind that could not be afforded back in your database management days in Web 2 at all. Like,
yeah,
there's no way that would have happened. It would have been 3, 4 hours of downtime, let alone a major hurricane knocking down the database, and the quality of service goes to the floor, and all these things
yeah.
happen, but that's just not possible. And
Yeah, I did a couple of checks too, because we have some protocols that we work really closely with, just in terms of their subgraph support, and just checked and made sure that there were other indexers on it, and everyone was so well supported that I didn't even feel the need to reach out to the client and say, hey, our server might be down,
mm,
because we only represent 10% of their total support or whatever. and
sure,
and and that was a really powerful thing that just you know it doesn't necessarily exist outside, unless you're just solely reliant upon cloud infrastructure,
sure,
right?
sure, sure. Well, I'm happy you're safe. I'm happy your family is safe, and I've got friends in Tampa too, and they seem to be doing okay. So, interesting
Yep.
times, interesting times. I want to ask for we've got a lot of different builders in the audience, and they
Sure.
are building primarily subgraphs and substreams. When you first got introduced to subgraphs, substreams, when you first started thinking, okay, the graph, I know databases, I can become an indexer,
Yep.
how does this work? Um, what progress have you seen over the years in terms of subgraph development and specifically in regards to how the interfaces with graph node and
Mhm.
how different it is, and also substreams? Is that gotten to the point where you're feeling it is it's at the point where you just have seen a better experience for the most part for the developing community who's building on these different technologies?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's really nice is being able to be connected to the source of the team that built GraphNode, right?
Mm,
And so, from my perspective, I can raise issues with the team and say, hey, I'd really like to be able to do this thing, and being able to see those things implemented into GraphNode is awesome.
mm,
Like there was a simple one of more recently, I think it was like 6 months ago, we got the derived fields loader,
yep.
which for those of us that have never built a subgraph, you can basically you can connect two data points where you say, hey, this has a natural relationship between those things. But you don't need to like define all of those relationships. You just kind of say, hey, these two things are connected, right? And inside the subgraph, sometimes you need to re-reference some of those data points to then do other counters or other aggregations or whatever, right? And previously you weren't able to reference some of those data points if you just said, hey, these two things are connected. You'd have to manually list this is connected to the first and the second and the third record and the fourth record and all that type of stuff. And that was like a feature addition that I was really excited for. And now I can go through and utilize that to build stronger and better subgraphs. And
Mm,
so, as time progresses, I like to be very vocal about, hey, these are the things that I need and I want as a subgraph developer. But then also looking on the side of an indexer, it gets very interesting because we're working on tuning our database and figuring out ways of like, okay, let's make the assumption that we don't control the subgraph and we don't control the queries, right? What
mm,
can we do to further optimize this subgraph? And some of those things are individual tweaks that we can apply at the indexer level. But then
mm,
some of them are features that can be added to subgraphs saying like, hey, this is something a feature that we want subgraph developers to be able to state so that we
mm,
can better understand what is their intended use when they deploy this thing.
mhm,
And so, like one example is the addition of immutable entities. Um, if you have a piece of data that you're storing in your subgraph and you don't expect that data to ever change, then we can change the way that that data gets stored inside of our database because we're not expecting multiple versions of that data point, right?
mhm.
And so there's certain optimizations that can go into place that will help that. I'm trying not to go too technical on things,
Well,
but
you
if
can get
if you want me
technical
to
if you
dig
want.
deeper, I'm very happy to do so.
Yeah, I mean, you can go a little bit technical. I think that's okay. We've got a
Okay,
technical
great.
audience. And yeah, I guess I'll double down on that, and keep on going on that. So, what happens? Let's say if someone doesn't use immutable entities versus someone
Yes.
that does use immutable entities on your end, and how much
Yep.
performance
Okay. So
increases are we seeing?
so the structure of the table is slightly different. The reason being, like, let's use a real world example. We'll just use like a Uniswap pool, right?
Mm,
So, the subgraph comes in, it says, okay, great, we need to create this pool. So boom, we get a record inside of our database. And it has the pool address and it has certain metrics about it. What's the total trade volume on this pool? What's the total amount of fees earned by this pool? How many transactions have been made to this pool? Right?
mhm,
All of those just different metrics, they start at zero because the pool was just created. Okay, great. So now someone does a swap, right? You finally have your first transaction, you have a little bit of volume, a little bit of trades, right? All that type of stuff. So in the database, what it does is it's going to insert a second record. It doesn't actually update the one record. And the reason being is that we need to have a full archival history. Because in the event that we need to rewind our subgraph or go back in time and reprocess some blocks, we need to have a full archive.
mhm,
And the thing that's cool about that is what enables our time traveling queries. So if you want to be able to say like, hey, what was the price of some token as of block X or block 1 million or whatever you want, you can time travel and look back. And that time traveling query is used very frequently if you want to be able to see what was the price of some token 24 hours ago and the price now. And
Mhm.
here's the percent of change, which is something that a application will oftentimes show. And
Mhm.
so those time traveling queries are very relied upon inside of the analytics pages and stuff like that. But in order to satisfy those time traveling queries, you need to have archival data.
Mhm.
So okay, good. So that's an example of a pool which has metrics, and those metrics change. So that would be a mutable record. But then you might have something that's just like a token, right? USDC, and the symbols aren't going to change on that, and the decimals aren't going to change on that. And so you know that there's only going to be one version of that entity because it's never going to change,
Mhm.
right? So that has a different structure in our database, and there's a field that allows us to be able to track whether something's archival
Mhm.
or whether it's just kind of a live entity and when it was created. And so
Mhm.
by stating, hey, this is an immutable entity, we trim down the amount of data that we need to store pretty dramatically on the column level.
Mhm.
And that way you're going to have faster queries because you don't have to use more complex operators to be able to see like, okay, is this the version of the entity that is currently accurate based off of the current chain head, or are we time traveling?
Mhm.
You can forget all that because you don't need that. Everything's immutable.
Mhm.
So use immutable entities. It'll improve your query speeds as well. And from the indexer side, it makes my database trimmer and more optimized. So it helps with the storage side on the supplier end.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I'm really, really happy that you brought up immutable entities and
Yeah.
now understanding a little bit more about that processing speed increase. What are a few other things that you wish you could magically flip a decentralized switch and it would change all the subgraphs to optimize all of them magically tomorrow? What would be the other changes besides immutable entities that you wish you could change just to help your
Oh
system?
man, that's kind of a tough question. Like there's kind of this concept of in a graph of having your edges and your nodes, and a lot of the times you want to put like and this is true for just general data structure, right? Knowing that you're going to insert a new record every time that you change any value on side of a pool, right? Like using that same USDC example, right? If we put a total volume tracked on the token level,
Mhm.
right? And then every time someone trades USDC, you're inserting another record into your token table
Mm.
with a new volume of USDC. And now all of a sudden your token table has 30 million records because your application has 30 million swaps. Well, that makes that table tougher to query.
Sure.
If you only have 10,000 records inside of your token table, it's going to be super easy to reference.
Mhm.
And so from my perspective, being able to shift off some of your metrics that are going to be your mutable data changes that you want to be able to reference, is something that would be very smart to do. Especially if you're constantly, traversing in your GraphQL query, you have kind of your nested query of the token, and you want to know the symbols or the symbol and the decimals and the name of it or something like
Mhm.
that. So that would just be one. Also, I would say avoid uh, avoid arrays as much as possible.
Hasn't
One thing that
derived
people
from solved all of that though?
Yeah, it should. If you haven't used it, please do. And here's why. So when you have an array that's stored in the database, once the array gets too big, the database is like, okay, we're gonna have to change the way that we store this, right? We're gonna have to turn this into a blob, which is a term that blockchain people are a lot more familiar with because we now have blobs on chain. So, it's a binary large object, and that the way that gets stored in your database, it's different, right? And then as soon as you have, let's say you have a table that has, a million records, right? And each of them have that array column. As soon as you have one record that reaches the length of the array where it's like, it's blob time, baby. Now all of a sudden your table is like, okay, all the records are about to blob, right? And so now you this one table that was, it was okay to begin with, it all of a sudden just became, unwieldy because that array became too long. There's definitely circumstances where you want to manually maintain an array, but hopefully you can avoid that entirely by just creating an entity, and then you create your relationship to that entity and use derived field loaders.
Yep.
Way
And
better that way.
I just shared the docs for using derived from in chat. So hopefully, if any,
Oh, great.
yes,
Yeah,
so you're
yeah,
getting
that's a
your
big
wish.
one.
Yes, you're getting your wish. If you can snap your fingers,
Yeah.
how to get how to get the developers out there to use some features.
Oh, can I just say another one?
Oh
Sorry,
yeah.
there's a lot of things. So the other one is, and this is especially relevant for people who are building protocols, building smart contracts, which I think a lot of people that are getting into blockchain are getting excited about Solidity and what can the blockchain do and what new use cases can I think of. And a lot of the times they don't necessarily think about the read portion of the blockchain, right? Because that gets more into like the develop or the user experience of your application,
Hmm.
which people, that's not usually the first thing people think about. But if you're at the stage of writing your contracts, start building your subgraph now. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with developers who deploy their contracts and they're immutable. And it's like, great, can't change my contracts, but I'm missing a single data point in my events. How do I get to my data? And it's like, okay, great. Maybe you can make, RPC calls inside of your event handlers. Maybe, hopefully you don't have to do this, but maybe you can use a call handler, right? Like using call handlers is just going to prevent sync performance tremendously.
Hmm.
Um, Adding in RPCs or RPC calls inside of your mappings is going to slow down your sync speed. So if you're at the stage of you're working in the test net, you're iterating on your contracts, start building your subgraph now because you're going to see, oh, I totally forgot to include the token that this transaction occurred in, right? Like as a really easy example, with OpenSea and NFT trades. Initially, they were all trades happened in Ether, and then they were like, all right, let's go to multi-currency. So you can now buy NFTs in USDC and ApeCoin and Dragon Coin and whatever else. But their events never told you, hey, this sale occurred in this token. It just said, 0x123 sent 0xABC a token, and they sent them 20. And I'm like, 20 what? 20 USDC, 20 Ether? Because that's pretty different.
Hmm.
And so then you have to go through all this like backwards logic rather than just having a good event structured to begin with.
Yep. And I mean, I remember writing my first few smart contracts and then understanding that the power of smart contracts is not necessarily um, their code. It's more that almost the timed nature of them, and then anyone can interact at a certain time,
Yep.
and then that there's certain interactions at certain times that have certain values, and then that becomes this just absolute new way of looking at code, and
Yeah.
especially the actual the tracking and the logging of that code. The one part of that development is understanding events and understanding how events go right into subgraphs. There's an entire blog that is on the graph blog called event driven development. I'll drop that in chat here,
Great.
where it's exactly what you're talking about, Derek, like event driven development, like thinking about events. If you're lucky enough to have control and are developing smart contracts and you are on that team that or an individual or a group that has smart contracts, please think about your events. It makes everything so much easier.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately it's going to make my life slightly better, but it's going to make your life way better because at the end of the day, we'll sync it. We're happy to service, if it's a little bit more storage or a little bit more compute on our side, it's not a big deal. But what is a big deal is ultimately your application's liveness. And so that's why I super recommend that, because I've been in the circumstance where we have to build subgraphs for someone and they forgot a single data point inside one of their events, and it's like, okay, great, well, now what do we do?
Yep. Upgradable smart contracts, and
Yeah.
there you go. I wanted to ask, shifting on to, I know we have very technical people in the audience who've been building for years and they see indexers as something very different.
Yep.
But also, I also want to see if there's a bridge to be formed here where you, with the expertise as an indexer, could talk to subgraph developers out there, substream subgraph developers, and if they were to, let's say you're talking to a seasoned subgraph or a seasoned substream developer
Hmm.
who's been using indexers for years, well,
Yep.
what would that process like to learn about indexing? And let's say one of them has a curiosity about, well, maybe they'd like to become an indexer or learn about
Sure.
indexing. What would that process be like in your mind? That they already know, subgraphs and or substreams.
Yeah, I mean, my recommendation on that is, people that are very full stack and, have experience with, spinning up and maintaining your servers and all that type of stuff. That's definitely the people that I would recommend starting to look into this. If it's someone who's purely front end and has, a bit of an interest in databases, running an indexer is not, um, it's more complex than that, right? Because it gets real DevOps heavy. And so if you're someone that has some experience with DevOps, and it's something that you enjoy, I definitely recommend looking into it because it gives you all kinds of cool new features. Like one thing that I do kind of locally, just to kind of spill the beans a bit, is we have all this data stored inside of our Postgres database, and I can just write SQL queries and I can join multiple subgraphs together and have some fun little queries, right? And from my perspective as an indexer, like we'll take the graph network subgraph and then I join that over into the quality of service subgraph so I can see where traffic's at, and we can see, okay, well, are we allocated to the top producers and things like that. But you can make really interesting solutions when you're able to do those type of joins. So for people who are DevOps friendly and really data curious, those are the people that I would mostly recommend to check it out.
Very cool. Yeah, the concept you're talking about, subgraph composition, that was
Yep.
talked about
Yep.
by Paka, who was on here, I think, 3 or 4 sessions ago. And
Cool.
what does that mean to you? It's exciting to me, but I'm curious on your end as an indexer, if I'm going to be writing a subgraph that is being built on top of using Uniswap v3 as a data source.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you? What does that change? And what does that also look like for you in the future of kind of the graph? Because I think that has a lot of wide reaching implications.
Yeah, so there's two different concepts there, and I want to kind of split those concepts. One of them is subgraph composition, where we're able to use subgraphs as a data source for building out new subgraphs. So if someone deploys subgraph A, I could essentially just say, okay, cool, subgraph A is going to be my data source, but I want to add some more transformations on top of it, right? I want to enrich the data even further because I really care about, or I want to add a new APY calculation, based off of how I want to do it, right? So that is very powerful in its own steam, where you can use a subgraph as a data source. One of the things that I immediately expect to see, and I super recommend this, is starting to change the way that you think about subgraphs. Um, I would recommend, and I hope that this can end up just being like a default inside of the graph CLI, but you have subgraph A, right? When you're going to make a subgraph, you have subgraph A, which is just your raw event data. And if you need to make any RPC calls, you do that at kind of this base layer. And then you create subgraph B, which will take all of your extractions, right? All of your events and all of your ETH calls. And then you have subgraph B make all of your transformations, and it has the schema that you ultimately want to be able to query. And what that'll do is, like, if you need to iterate on top of your subgraph,
Ooh,
right? Or maybe you need to change some logic or, make a little tweak, you don't want to have to resync everything. Well, subgraph A is still syncing and you can still reference subgraph A and it's got all of your events there. And
right.
so now you can just expedite your entire resync process because you have all the events and you just kind of go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, rather than scanning the blocks, remaking RPCs, all those types of things. You just have all that stored locally. And from an indexer perspective, I'm like, great, I'm gonna, and hopefully if multiple developers are building subgraphs on the same contracts, like let's use Uniswap factory contract as an example, right?
Sure.
And they want to know pool created and the different events emitted by there. I can index that once and I can serve, two different people's transformation layer if they have different transformations, but they're using the same event structure, right? Because that would, so long as there aren't modifications there, would essentially produce the same IPFS hash, the same manifest, same mappings, and all that type of stuff because there's
Hmm.
no major changes there. And so like that to me, that's super interesting. And I'm very excited to play with it.
I
But
think that
definitely
I
consider it.
think, Derek, if you could do me a favor, let me
Yes.
know the name of this technique because this needs a name. Like this needs
Oh, I'll see what kind of quippy stuff me and my team can put together. But right now, I just think it's a more intelligent structure,
I
right?
know it just I'm just thinking it needs to have some type of name of this technique because this is going
Yeah,
to be in my
and if
mind
you look at
an optimal technique to use.
yeah, and if you look at kind of the ETL process, really it's compartmentalizing ETL,
Mhm.
right? So you have your
Yep.
blockchain as your source of truth. You have one subgraph that is just pure extraction, right?
Mhm.
And then you have another subgraph which does your transformation,
Mhm.
loads it into Postgres, and then adds the query layer on top of it.
That's great.
But yeah, but once that's deployed, like that is the thing that I am the most excited about in terms of subgraphs right now because
Yeah.
it'll allow us to iterate super quickly.
Right, and that's only with one level of subgraph composition. And I
Correct.
mean, that's crazy because I know
Yep.
I've been talking with others about, okay, well, this naturally being a development space is iterative. So one will eventually lead to two, and two will eventually
Yep.
lead to three. And that is an exciting waterfall of composition that I'm just like, okay, well, what does this do? And I think we have
Yeah.
that magical two-word thing happening of network effects of
Yeah.
really, truly a graph of data that can
Yep.
be grown in an organic way, which I'm just really excited for. So, um, well, that's about subgraph composition, and I feel like we got a little bit technical and a little
Yep.
bit kind of like optimization, which is good. I do want to talk about with you what are you looking forward to the most in the graph ecosystem that is not technical? Something that is like, do you think that we are heading towards that is something that you're looking forward to as an ecosystem?
That's a good question. Luckily, I'm privy to certain information that I don't know that I can or can't say. So like there's a whole lot of those things that I'm very excited for. And the future does look very bright in terms of our stance and also just like how we're going to be participating in different things, right? One thing that obviously we all know about is the Horizon contracts and what that's going to do to start allowing new data services, right? And so we're, for the most part, we're all pretty used to querying subgraphs. We've got the GraphQL API, right, that can feed our front end. But with the Horizon contracts, it opens the door to new possibilities, right? Really catering better to some of the analytics teams that they don't necessarily need live data. If it's 20 minutes stale, that's okay because ultimately they're trying to run, well, what happened in the last day? Let's look at metrics and really high level interactions.
Hmm.
And so they don't need data as of the last milliseconds, right?
Hmm.
And so very excited to see some of the different technologies that we put together in terms of servicing those needs. And then the other one, which I know that has been discussed, is which is different from subgraph composability, but subgraph interoperability. And this is something that I foresee is going to take a big part in our future. And Substreams already does this really well, right? Like with a substream, you can deploy a module, you can reference someone else's substream and grab that module and pipe in that data and all that stuff, or re-reference someone else's store and all that. And the builders DAO has already put together some substreams for like Chainlink Oracle prices and stuff like that. So if you need Chainlink Oracle prices inside of your substream, you can come to our repo, you grab it, it takes the same hash, you can re-reference that same store, so you don't need to re-index those things. And so from a composition layer, that's all exciting. But then we get into the concept of interoperability and how do I query two subgraphs at once or two data sources at once, and how do I just kind of like join those metrics together? Because that was something I was mentioning earlier. Like I do that on my side because I have access to this huge compendium of thousands of subgraphs and different data points, right? Like constantly joining ENS to like all kinds of stuff, right? Because I want to know like, okay, does this person have an on-chain identity that I might be able to reference, right? And then joining that into uh, Polygon staker information, because we also run a Polygon validator, right? and then being able to utilize that data to make more more intelligent decisions.
Mhm.
But I definitely foresee a near future where we're able to do that more in network and not just from within data nexus's Postgres instance, right? And that way we can reference not only like two different subgraphs, but subgraphs across different chains,
Yeah.
right? If you're deployed on 8 different chains and you want to know your total protocols TVL, or the total value locked across all the different chains for your protocol, you just want to be able to join that information or aggregate it as a whole, and then you can say, okay, great, across all chains my protocol has X amount of TVL, and right now it would involve making 8 different individual queries if you were deployed on 8 chains, and assuming that all of them go through successfully and rapidly. You're currently stuck with what's the phrase for the you're waiting for the slowest query to complete in order to get your results,
Mhm.
right? With this interoperability, you can essentially just make all of that into a single query, and then it joins together inside the database layer, and it performs a little bit nicer.
That's so exciting. Yeah, I am imagining a decentralized, unified data layer that
Yeah,
would provide so much more power and speed for these exact, I mean, exact use cases you were talking about. Let's say you have a certain smart contract deployed on 8 different chains. You
yep.
know that can be a hindrance. So that's
And
very
and one thing to touch on there too is that because we work mostly with reading information, right? Like a lot of people are focused on blockchain data from the capabilities that it offers, right? I can deploy a smart contract that can do X, Y, and Z, and that all has to do with the right layer. And so that gives your users essentially new functionality, which is very exciting. But in the read world, we're mostly focused with like, okay, well, what is the user experience, right? And you need to have good sources of information in order to build out a seamless user experience for the people that are going to be using your application. And I think we're starting to see more and more focus. I mean, you see people on crypto Twitter saying like, all right, we need to make blockchain simpler, right? Like how's my father-in-law going to interact with this type of stuff, right? And a lot of that comes down to having good sources of information and being able to make a really seamless user experience, which is
Mhm.
that's where the graph really comes in, is because we help enable new user experiences so that people can rapidly make easy decisions and take actions.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great point. I like also that we're thinking, 3, 4, 5 steps down the line, just in this
Yep.
conversation where it's saying, hey, we know we've got to the point where things are better with the graph, but already we're thinking, all right, well, composability and also
Yep.
interoperability, and then having this unified data layer is just gonna. We're already thinking, and I'm always thinking, how can I make the experience better for developers? Having developers have better experiences will have the user have better experiences. So
Yeah, absolutely.
it's like if a developer is happy, they're going to make better projects and better applications for everybody. So
Yeah, and that's obviously a flywheel, right? As the developer has a good experience, their users have a good experience. The users are using the application, which is ultimately in some fashion going to pay the developer. So now they're happy and they're building more, right? And so that is a flywheel.
it is. It is. It really is. Well, I want to thank you for your time, Derek. I mean, I've known of you, and I've known you for years in this ecosystem. So I'm really
Yeah.
happy to have you on the Builders Office Hours. And if there's anything you want to have developers viewing know right now, maybe do you want them to potentially reach out to you, or do you want them to take any action, any call to actions, anything like that right now? Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I would say one thing that I super recommend, especially if you're a subgraph developer on a team of people and like you're tasked with overseeing your team's subgraph, make sure to follow the graph tooling repo, right? Like follow the repos, because there's feature releases that I think we could be better about communicating out to the ecosystem of like, hey, here's a new feature. And I've seen it kind of just like new features kind of get snuck, they kind of sneak in there. I'm like, whoa, that just got released. Like that's so exciting to me. And if I wasn't like subscribed to the actual repo itself, I would have totally missed it. right? And so I'm constantly reading the release notes of like, all right, what's coming and stuff like that. So I super recommend that because you'll see things, and as those get released, if you see something where you're like, what is that? Check the docs, jump into Discord, ask us what it is, ask us how it might apply to your specific situation, because subgraphs are all super different. So that would
Mhm.
be one immediate call to action that I would recommend.
Mhm.
And then also, if you're not in our Discord, hop into our Discord. Um, you know, there's a ton of builders. We're a lot of fun. Well, a lot of us are a lot of fun. And then, but yeah, we'll definitely help with getting your product ready to go and troubleshooting anything that you run into.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Derek, thank you so much for your time. If you can just stay on this Riverside
Yeah,
platform
yeah,
while I say goodbye on stream. Uh, Thanks for joining everyone on stream. Thanks for joining another episode of Graph Builders Office Hours. If you have any questions, concerns, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you guys learn to build better and get you guys in contact with those that are building in the ecosystem. So, with that being said, everyone, have a good rest of your day, and I'll see y'all next week.